Level 12 monsters are the highest level monsters in the game, and it's also a pretty rare level that doesn't get used very much. So in this video, we'll go over the best level or rank 12 monsters in the game. And at number 10, we have Blue Eye's Ultimate Dragon. This is the only non-effect monster on this list, and this card surprisingly sees play in meta decks, just not in the way you'd expect. Blue Eye's Ultimate Dragon sees almost no play in actual Blue Eyes decks, as there are better alternatives to bring out Blue Eyes with 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons as fusion materials. No, Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon sees play in Tenyi decks and Necros mostly, because Tenyi decks have a trap card called Fists of the Unrivaled Tenyi, which has a floating effect that if it's destroyed by your opponent, you can special summon a non-effect monster from your extra deck. And Blue Eye's Ultimate Dragon is the strongest target for the card. And Necros decks have a ritual spell card called Necros Kaleidoscope, which allows you to use an extra deck monster as the materials to bring out ritual monsters from your hand. So sometimes they'll just run Blue Eye's Ultimate Dragon as a level 12 monster to bring out multiple ritual monsters from their hand that have levels that add up to it. They don't need to use Blue Eye's Ultimate Dragon for this. They could use any level 12 extra deck monster. It's just, since it doesn't matter, some people like to use Blue Eye's Ultimate Dragon. And at number 9, we have Herald of Ultimateness. This is a level 12 ritual monster, the only level 12 ritual monster in the game in fact, and it actually has a really good effect. This card is basically a Solemn Judgment in monster card form, as if your opponent would special summon a monster, or activate a card effect, you can send a fairy type monster from your hand to the graveyard to negate the summon or activation of that card and destroy it. And this effect is not once per turn, nor once per chain. So as long as you're able to supply materials for this card's negates, you can negate everything until you run out of fairy type monsters in your hand. Now, there is another similar ritual monster called Herald of Perfection, who is able to send fairies from the hand to negate card effects, but Herald of Perfection can't negate summons, like Herald of Ultimateness can. Although, Herald of Perfection has a ritual spell card, which both allows you to bring it out like normal, and has a graveyard effect, where it can banish itself to add one of the materials back to your hand that was used for its ritual summon. Whereas the ritual spell card for Herald of Ultimateness just has a spell speed 4 effect, where your opponent can't activate cards in response to its ritual summon, which is fine. Herald of Perfection is just much better, because it's easier to bring out at a lower level of 6, has 2800 defense, which is really hard to beat over it without activating card effects, and Herald of Ultimateness still has low attack at only 2000, is harder to bring out, and the only upside to it is that it can negate summons as well. It's supposed to be an upgraded version of Herald of Perfection, but is kind of more cumbersome to use, and becomes not as good, ironically, as one of the problems of Herald of Perfection was that it has really low attack, so you have to constantly keep it in defense position, whereas Herald of Ultimateness has the same problem, and is harder to bring out, and doesn't have a good ritual summon card. It's just kind of worse in every aspect, except for the fact that it technically has slightly better stats. One of the best ways to use this card is probably to send a whole bunch of monsters to the graveyard with advanced ritual art, since this is the highest level ritual monster in the game. And its effect is technically good, which is why it still makes this list, but at kind of a low spot. And at number 8, we have Assault Blackwing, Onimaru the Divine Thunder. Now, for a long time, this was the only generic level 12 synchro monster, which means you could use any tuner and non-tuner materials in order to create this card, as all the other level 12 synchro monsters required special materials. And since this card had 3000 attack and could not be destroyed by card effects, it wasn't half bad as a level 12 generic monster, although not good enough to see play outside of Blackwing decks. Because inside of Blackwing decks, this card is treated as a tuner if it's brought out using a Blackwing as one of its materials, it can change its level to that of any Blackwing monster in your graveyard, and it has an additional once per duel effect, where if this card is brought out with only synchro monsters as its materials, it can gain 3000 attack during one attack, which is not a very good effect to have on such a difficult activation requirement, as well as having a once per duel clause to it. So this card gets a low spot on this list at only number 8. And at number 7, we have Divine Serpent Geh. This is the only main deck monster on this list, but that's because there surprisingly aren't too many good level 12 main deck monsters. Although Divine Serpent isn't half bad when compared to the rest of this list, as this card has a pretty easy summoning condition, which combos well with most decks. It has decent protection, can destroy monsters while bypassing destruction immunities, and can attack over pretty much anything. You can only special summon this card from your hand if a monster you control is destroyed, but you have to pay half your life points in order to do this. While this card is on the field, it can't be targeted by card effects, and it has 2 battle effects. One of them is if this card is involved in any battle, you can change this card's original attack to be the highest original attack on the field. And its other effect is if this card declares an attack on a monster, you can have your opponent's monster's attack and negate that monster's effects. And since the ability to change this card's original attack is not a temporary one, you can just keep a high attack power value for this card as long as you want, and then choose to change it if a stronger monster hits the field. And the only real way your opponent can get rid of this card is by destroying it with non-targeting card effects, or by suicide attacking into this monster with a high attack monster. So it's kind of difficult for your opponent to get rid of this card without losing a monster. Because while this card can attack over pretty much anything, as it negates the opponent's monster's effects while also cutting their attack in half. So, for example, if it tries to attack over an Eater of Millions, it won't activate its effect to banish this card. Or if it tries to attack over a Dingirsu, it can't use its effect to protect itself. But if a Dingirsu tries to crash into this card, and it has the highest attack on the field, then it can destroy Divine Serpent, and then just use its effect to protect itself from getting destroyed. Since the effect to match the highest attack on the field can be used during any battle, but its effect to have the opponent's monster attack can only be used when it itself declares an attack. So, even with all of these confusing restrictions to it, it's still a pretty decent card. It doesn't see any competitive play, however, which is why it takes kind of a lower spot on this list, but still makes this list over all the other main deck level 12 monsters, as at least this card is useful and easy to use. And at number 6, we have Ultimaya Tzolkin. This is technically a level 12 synchro monster, who can only be brought out with 2 level 5 or higher monsters at the same level, as long as one of them is a tuner, and has the effect where you can cheat out synchro monsters from the extra deck every time you set a spell or trap card. Although you can only do this once per turn, and it only works on level 7 or 8 dragon type synchro monsters or power tool synchro monsters. And while this card has no stats, it also cannot be targeted for attacks or effects if you control another synchro monster. And this card was incredibly difficult to play during Master Rule 4, because it cheats synchro monsters out of the extra deck, which need to go to a link zone or an extra monster zone. But with the Master Rule revisions, this card will be a lot more playable, as you can bring out the synchro monsters to just any of your main monster zones, and there's a lot of good targets for this card, specifically Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, who can negate monster effects. And if you're able to set cards during your opponent's turn, you can special summon another monster. There's only a handful of cards which allow you to set spell or traps during your opponent's turn, like Dust Tornado or Scrap Iron Scarecrow, so this caveat of its effect isn't as well known since those aren't very good cards. But being able to cheat out a level 7 or 8 dragon synchro monster is pretty good, considering a lot of the best synchro monsters are level 7 or 8 dragon type monsters. And I only have this card at a middling spot on this list because it sees almost 0 play during Master Rule 4, and we really have to wait to see if the Master Rule revision will make sure this card comes back and sees play, which I assume it will. And at number 5, we have YuGiOh Mathmech Final Sigma. This was the 3rd ever generic level 12 synchro monster, and it was released recently, in the last year in fact. So was the 2nd ever generic level 12 synchro monster. That card is also pretty recent as it came out in 2019, but that card is not super good. There's a huge lack of generic level 12 synchro monsters, considering there's only 13 total level 12 synchro monsters in the game, so it kinda makes sense. And out of all of the generic level 12 synchro monsters, YuGiOh Mathmech Final Sigma is the best of the bunch, as it's unaffected by card effects while it's in the extra monster zone, If it battles while it's in the extra monster zone, you can inflict double battle damage, and if this card is destroyed, you get to add a Mathmech card from your deck to your hand. So it floats into a pretty good search effect. Now, generally, being immune to all card effects is super good. That's why it has restrictions where it has to be in the extra monster zone. But it's also still affected by other Mathmech cards, so you can still use its support cards on it. But since no one else is playing Mathmech cards, you don't have to worry about your opponent destroying this card with card effects. And its double battle damage effect is just icing on the cake. If this card just had a little bit more attack though, and it was at like 3100 for example, it would be so much better. Because matching 3000 attack is not that difficult for a lot of decks. So even if this card is immune to all card effects, you can just beat over it pretty easily in battle, which is why it still gets kind of a low spot on this list, but it's still the best level 12 generic synchro monster. And at number 4, we have number 77, the 7 Sins. This is one of 4 rank 12 monsters, as there's even fewer of those than there are synchro monsters, to give you an idea of how few level 12 monsters there are. And because there's so few level 12 monsters, the only reason this card makes this list is because it has an alternative summoning condition. You can bring this card out with 2 level 12 monsters, although that's pretty rare, as almost no deck brings out level 12 monsters regularly. So it has another effect where you can also exceed summon this card on top of a rank 10 or 11 dark exceeds monster. And then you attach all of their materials to this card as well. And then this card has the effect where you can detach 2 materials to banish all of your opponent's special summon monsters. Then attach one of those banished monsters to this card as a material. And it has another effect where if this card would be destroyed, you can detach a material instead. Now, the reason this card sees play is because it allows you to convert those monsters into 4K beatstick that has protection from destruction effects, which is pretty useful if you bring out something like number 80 Pain Gainer to destroy some of your opponent's monsters after ranking it up on top of another card, which probably did something else. And then you get to end it off with a 4K beatstick with protection. The 7 Sins is generally used at the end of a long rank up chain, and rarely is brought out in order to banish your opponent's cards. But the fact that it can be brought out to do that as well makes it pretty good, and why it definitely deserves a middling spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Red Supernova Dragon, a synchro monster which was released pretty recently in the OCG and is currently not in the TCG yet. And this card has a pretty good effect where I felt pretty confident in placing it in the top 5 of this list, because sure, this card has some pretty cumbersome synchro materials. You need to have 3 tuner monsters plus a non-tuner synchro monster as materials, but it has really good effects. If your opponent activates a monster effect or declares an attack, you can then chain this card's effect to it, where you banish this card from the field, as well as all cards your opponent controls. And then this card will return during your next end phase. So it's kind of like Stardust Dragon's effect in response to an opponent's card effect to try and stop it, and then it will bring itself back later. Only this card is a full board wipe every time it does this, and in one of the best ways, as it banishes all of your opponent's cards. There's lots of cards that float when they're destroyed by card effects, but incredibly few that float when they're banished. Almost nobody wants their cards to get banished, and there's very little protection from being banished as well. This effect is just great, so any effects on top of this would just be kind of extra, as it does have some other neat things about this card. This card gains 500 attack for each tuner in your graveyard, so it should gain 1500 attack from just the 3 tuners used for its summon, bringing this card up to 5500 attack, which is really good. And it can't be destroyed by your opponent's card effects, so it has a little bit of a built-in protection, which is not half bad. So a big beatstick that can banish your opponent's entire field at a moment's notice, and is slightly inconvenient to take out, is a pretty great card, only hampered by its difficult summoning requirement. But this is one of those cards where it's definitely worth that summoning requirement. And I should also mention, since this card banishes itself in order to use its effect, it's a great synchro monster to play in Master Rule 4, as when it returns to the field, it can return to a non-extra monster zone or a non-link zone. You can just put it wherever you want, similar to Psy-Frame Lord Omega, which is a huge plus for this card, which won't really matter once the Master Rule revisions go through. And at number 2, we have Shooting Quasar Dragon. Speaking of strong synchro monsters that are hard to bring out, we kind of have to talk about Quasar Dragon, as this is the synchro boss monster. Quasar Dragon has the effect where once per turn, you can just negate and destroy the effect of any one card. A once per turn negate on anything is super good, but on top of that, this card has 4,000 attack and has the ability to attack a number of times equal to the number of non-tuner monsters used for its synchro summon. And since this card requires at least 2 or more non-tuner synchro monsters, by baseline it can attack 2 times. So right out of the gate, if you're able to clear your opponent's field, Quasar Dragon can win you the game on its own by just attacking twice, and rarely is it brought out with more materials, because it's kind of hard to get this guy's materials on the field in the first place, as this card requires all synchro monsters as its materials. You need a tuner synchro monster, plus 2 or more non-tuner synchro monsters, which requires a whole bunch of synchro summoning and having link zones available, which is why this card sees almost no play in Master Rule 4. It still sees play occasionally in Necros decks, but for the same reason Blue Eye's Ultimate Dragon sees play in those decks, because it's a level 12 extra deck monster who can be used with Necros Kaleidoscope to ritual summon monsters. Now on top of this card's Omnigate effect and being able to attack twice, it has a floating effect, where if this card just leaves the field, you get to special summon a Shooting Star Dragon from your extra deck. Shooting Star Dragon is a difficult to bring out level 10 synchro monster, who can potentially attack multiple times during the battle phase, and has a once per turn negate the effect of a card which destroys cards on the field, and can stop one attack during the battle phase by banishing itself, and then returning to the field during the end phase. And at 3,300 attack, this card is pretty good in its own right. So if your opponent is able to take out your Quasar Dragon, it just floats into another good synchro monster, which is why Quasar Dragon is so good. It does a lot of great things on the field, especially having one of the best effects a boss monster can have, an Omni Negate with no activation requirements or costs, and then floats into another boss monster on its destruction no matter how it leaves the field. Your opponent almost can't get rid of this card without activating its floating effect. Almost. Its floating effect technically can miss timing though, so if your opponent is smart about removing this card through its negate, then they can deny you of a Shooting Star Dragon. And at number 1, we have Super Quantal Mech King Great Magnus. This is a rank 12 monster whose effects depend on the number of Exceeds material this card would have with different names. At 6 or more cards, this card will have the effects to lock your opponent out of searching cards, become unaffected by card effects, and have a Spell Speed 2 Castell effect to shuffle one card on the field into the deck. And at 3,600 attack, this card is incredibly hard to beat over if you can just disrupt your opponent's plays with its quick effect, and the fact that it's immune to your opponent's card effects, and the fact that it can also stop your opponent from searching. That's just kind of a cherry on top. It's a super boss monster that you build into because it's really hard to take out. And when this card did see competitive play back in 2016, people would main deck kaiju monsters just to get this card out, because it was almost impossible to destroy it any other way. Although, this card was hurt very heavily by Master Rule 4, because the deck that can bring this card out requires a whole bunch of different Exceeds monsters hitting the field at the same time, as this card is rarely brought out through 3 level 12 monsters, and is generally brought out through the Field Spell card, which allows you to use your Super Quantal Exceeds monsters on the field as its materials, while also transferring their materials over to this card. Now, what's funny about Super Quantal Mech King Great Magnus is that it was decks revolving around turboing this card out that popularized the use of the Brilliant Fusion engine, which was so good that it's currently banned, as if the engine allowed a deck to turbo this card out to a competitive sense, then what if it was used in other engines that were more consistent? And then everyone started using the Brilliant Fusion engine, it became super popular, it eventually got limited, and then banned recently. And with Brilliant Fusion currently banned, Super Quantal Mech King Great Magnus is a lot harder to bring out, but they did also receive a pretty good Link monster, and there's some decks that are able to bring this card out pretty quickly outside of its archetype, as it's a really good boss monster to have, which is almost impossible to beat over. So I can probably see this card seeing competitive play again after the Master Rule revisions, which is part of the reason why I place this card at number 1, over something like Quasar Dragon, or even Red Supernova Dragon. Alright, and that's the list. This video idea was asked for by quite a few people, so If you have any ideas for future videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And also, did you know, there's almost 100 top 10 videos on this channel now. So if you want to watch nearly 100 videos as background noise while you play other video games, I'd highly suggest you watch the rest of the top 10 videos in the playlist.